I'm Thomas Thwaites. This is an exhibition of my work called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. It's work I've done over the past kind of decade or slightly more. Yikes. I guess this is the project that started it all. This is the Toaster Project, or at least a representation of the Toaster Project. And this is my MA graduation work. And I decided I would try and make one thing myself completely from scratch. So could I just make one mundane, everyday object starting from the raw materials as they come out of the ground? And the object I decided to try and make was an electric toaster. And, you know, it turns out even inside this kind of mundane, boring toaster, there's kind of 400 different components, hundreds of different materials, and then I tried to go to various mines, dig up the iron ore, smelt the iron ore into iron, or kind of try and make bioplastic and so on over about 9 months, and then eventually ended up with this, you know, toaster which didn't really work and was like some strange vision of a kind of post-apocalyptic future or something like that. So that's the Toaster Project, and then after that I was kind of wondering what to do next, and I kind of got interested in this idea of like whether the sort of scientific truth that we have at the moment, could that scientific truth be different? You know, scientists are always kind of revising science, and it, you know, science is, it's just a kind of agreed on story, really. And so I was wondering, could that story be different but still true? You know, it's a story that kind of fits the observations, but if the observations had been different and different people had kind of been emphasised in the sort of great argument of science, then could we have a different world, a different understanding of the world, a different truth? And out of that project, called Unlikely Objects, came these giant pink wings, and there was this whole kind of counterfactual fiction about how science and religion had never split, Darwin didn't exist, or he smashed his head on a rock getting off the Beagle at the Galapagos Islands, so he'd never triumphed in the great debate of evolution. And so there was this whole different world where the purpose of science was to make humans more angelic, and eugenics had played out very differently. This very unpleasant idea of changing ourselves to become more angelic. Anyway, a little bit complicated and confusing, like the history of science. And then, kind of, I guess off the back of that, I was asked to think about the future of crime, and this project is Policing Genes. I was kind of put together with a crime research organisation, and I had to, you know, think about the future of crime. And I started thinking about, well, what you know, new crime is often enabled by new technologies. Obviously, kind of, you know, sort of phishing and wireless fraud and all of that is kind of enabled by online payments. You know, so this new technology brings lots of new benefits, but lots of new opportunities for crime. It's kind of the dual use problem. So I was thinking about, well, new technologies coming down the pipeline, kind of obviously biotechnologies, kind of very much coming into the mainstream. And so how will the police have to respond to, you know, biotechnology if it kind of becomes much more accessible to kind of amateurs, or if, you know, genetically modified plants are grown more widely to kind of produce useful drugs. There's this idea that you can genetically engineer a plant, so as it grows, it produces like a useful drug that can, you know, help with Alzheimer's or something. And so I came up with the police genetic surveillance unit, and the idea is that the police would have these beehives dotted around, and the bees would kind of fly out, visit plants with, you know, flowering plants, get the flowers' DNA all over them in the pollen, come back to the hive, and then the hive takes a little sample of the pollen, brushes it off the bee as it comes in, and then that pollen is analysed for kind of genes which shouldn't be there in that plant, so genes which somebody has either put in to kind of, you know, do some bioterrorism or to kind of grow some kind of either illegal narcotic or to, you know, infringe on somebody else's patent. And then if they found some of this suspect pollen, then the camera records the waggle dance that the bee does in a hive, and then the police decode the waggle dance, and then they can kind of find out where the bee has been, where it got that suspect pollen from, and then go and, you know, go and do a search of that kind of area. And so it was this whole kind of fiction about the future of crime, the future of biotechnology. Which then Scotland Yard in London, the big police headquarters, they became interested in it and invited me in to talk about it. And so, yeah, and then I guess that kind of brings me on to this project, Go Man, and this was a project that kind of began with the sort of thought that, like, wow, it's so complicated and difficult and sort of depressing sometimes being a human being. We, you know, live with all of these difficult complications, you know, but perhaps it would be nicer to just have a holiday from that and to kind of become an animal, you know. And so I kind of wrote a funding application to the Wellcome Trust, and they gave me some money to become, to take a holiday from being a human. And I ended up becoming a goat because I wasn't sure which animal I should become, so I went to visit a shaman, and she kind of said, you know, we went through a few different animals, and she said maybe a goat would be a good animal for you. And then, you know, went around sort of interviewing scientists, interviewing experts, ended up dissecting a goat. This is the bones of Venus the goat, and ended up kind of trying to make these sort of exoskeletons, these prosthetics, such that I could walk like a goat, and of course it was much more difficult than I thought. These are the kind of the final prosthetics that I took to the mountains. I also had a prosthetic rumen so I could digest grass, and I also kind of looked at, or had my brain, the cortex of my brain interrupted, which switched off my ability to speak temporarily. And then I went to the mountains, the Swiss Alps, and kind of trying to live as a goat. So here are some images. Yeah, and it was a very difficult time, quite difficult, quite sort of unpleasant, really. I was desperately trying to forget that I was a human being. I'm not sure I really ever did manage to forget I was a human being. But I think ultimately what the project is about the kind of the story that we tell ourselves, or at least the story that I had somehow grown up telling myself, that, you know, human civilization is all about progress, and in a way it is, but you know, I'd kind of really taken on board this story that, you know, don't worry, you know, there's kind of bumps and ups and downs along the road, but ultimately, you know, kind of liberal, progressive ideas will triumph, and technology will save us, and ultimately, we'll be flying around like in Star Trek amongst the stars, blah 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 blah, and all of that. Whereas the life of a goat doesn't have any of that. It's just you live. You're born, you live on a hillside, and you die, and there's none of this kind of idea of this fantasy of making a contribution to like the onward march of human civilization and all that. And so for me it was about this project is about rejecting that idea of progress, that idea of necessary progress. It was about questioning that kind of story. Where do we want to progress to? Should we in fact try and progress to a kind of more simple, humble existence? Should we stop trying to be successful humans? Should we just kind of give up and just be, live life a bit more like a goat does? I'm not sure. Anyway, so there's a couple of projects in here. This is a project called Parasite Labs, and it was a project where I figured I'd make kind of prosthetics for humans, for myself. So what would a prosthetic for a plant look like? And so this is a kind of heart-lung machine for a plant, in that it takes over the circulation and circulatory systems of the plant, the xylem system and the phloem system, and the idea is that plugged into this machine, limbs from a tree or another plant could survive without a trunk and without any light, because it's being fed the nutrients it would get from its roots, and it's being fed the sugar that it would normally get by photosynthesizing. Unfortunately, it didn't really work, so these are very much not alive. But I was kind of collaborating with a scientist at Imperial College, and she was very keen on the idea. And I think it would take a PhD in biotechnology to actually get this to work. I realised as I was kind of halfway through. And then just on the wall here is a film that I made for the Design Museum in London. It's kind of like a 20-minute sort of little series of 9 episodes, I call it, and it's kind of 9 questions about, what we can, what is happening with design and sustainability, and, basically the future of commercialism, like industrial civilization, and where, what's going to happen, how does that need to change? Will it be able to change in the face of the climate crisis? One of the people I interviewed is a neo-peasant who thinks it's on the verge of collapse, and he's given up his job to become a kind of smallholder. And another person I interviewed is the Chief Sustainability Officer of IKEA, who had completely the opposite idea that, don't worry, we're capitalism and the industry will solve it. And, who knows? Some days I wake up thinking, yeah, don't worry, it'll be fine. Some days I wake up thinking, no, actually, it's all over. Our goose is cooked. So, yeah, who knows? This is a calendar of 400 years. Each line is a year. It starts in 1772 and goes to 2251. Currently we are here, the 25th of September 2023, and it's a Monday. I put the weekends on the calendar, and I think I like this project just because it really helps to diminish your own sense of importance. You know, it's yeah, there's a lot of days there. My life is about that much on the calendar, you know, and so I just quite like it because it just, you can see time, and I think quite a lot of my work is thinking about the future, thinking about the past, what might have happened differently, what might happen in the future. And so this project is, you know, just kind of locates you somehow. It's grounding. And so I suppose we should go and see the harmless car, which is outside. So this is the harmless car in its parking spot here. And the idea is that this is a car that is harmless to everything. You know, could you make an object, make a car that, you know, didn't harm, you know, any humans, that didn't harm any kind of creatures, that didn't cause harm to even a tiny snail? If it kind of rolls over it with its wheels, it's kind of harmless in the materials used. And so it's this, I suppose, this dream of being able to kind of live your life without causing, you know, without contributing to that, this, you know, this feeling of guilt that I have, and I think lots of people have, about, you know, our kind of lifestyles. We know that we have to change, but the question is how. And I think design as a kind of, as a practice, as a discipline, as a kind of commercial pursuit, on the one hand, you know, designers, they're often kind of making objects that, you know, make people's lives better. That's the kind of orthodox view of design. But the flip side of that coin is, now we know that also it's, you know, going to make somebody, you know, this object, this beautiful new thing that you buy, it's also making somebody's life worse. Maybe somebody, you know, living in the future as their kind of climate breaks down, or, you know, maybe somebody kind of on the other side of the world, you know, in a kind of poorer country, you know, is this object contributing to, you know, the degradation of their environment? And so this car is like an attempt to make something harmless, but it's doomed to fail. You know, for one, it's very difficult to make a car, but for two, it's impossible to make a harmless car. And so the question becomes, like, if you can't be harmless, well, then who would you choose to harm? You know, would you choose to harm, you know, the kind of the future, people living in the future, which is kind of the choice that we seem to be making at the moment. You know, if we continue, you know, basically living a kind of unchanged lifestyle, or do we choose to kind of, you know, bring some of that harm on ourselves and kind of change what we do? You know, we can't have, you know, new cars, we can't, you know, live this very kind of fast lifestyle that we have been living. You know, do we kind of harm our own lifestyles? And so that's the kind of question that I'm trying to ask with this car. I don't know exactly what the answer is, of course. I do know that it's impossible to be harmless, and so, you know, how is that kind of calculus of harm changing? You know, where is it now acceptable to kind of, you know, for the harm to fall, as we, you know, buy and consume and create new objects?